Hey, Alan, we are back for another episode of Avoid Crisis podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well. What episode are we on, Ray?
Uh, eight, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah. Wow.
All right. Let's jump. We got a lot of content. We're going to try to make it tighter. I believe our topics today, we're just going to try to get into. Um, we've got Sudan. Is it the new Wuhan?
Mhm.
And the other topic was the First Republic Bank ricochet of deposits.
Yeah, it's like a bullet, huh? A lot to talk about on First Republic and lots to talk about on Sudan. But why would we start talking about Sudan now when we're talking about avoid crisis? I think the thing is that it's obviously a humanitarian crisis, and it's also a crisis for the Americans that are there right now. 16,000 Americans are trying to be evacuated from Sudan right now.
Yeah.
So this is a really big issue. But you started off with saying Sudan, is it the new Wuhan? And I think that there's a lot to kind of maybe put into perspective here with Sudan. As we were talking about this before, we were talking about, why is Sudan important just overall? Isn't it just another African country that is going through the geographical redistribution, or is it something more? So maybe a little bit of background might help. Um, Maybe the first thing to kind of be aware of is that there's 46 million people living in Sudan. And it's also bordering the Red Sea. Do we have like a map or anything that we could maybe show that kind of just points that out? Yeah. So if you take a look here and you see where Sudan is, and you see right across the Red Sea is Saudi Arabia, and you look at how this goes up to the northwest. At the top there in Egypt, you've got the Suez Canal.
Hmm.
And so you look at what's happening with Sudan. You look at how big of a country it is, very large, and it has a lot of mineral deposits in the country. There's a lot of gold. There's a lot of rare earth material. So the thing is that there's valuable resources in that whole geography. And on top of that, what you have is you have this um, other bigger issue going on, which is that it's a part of an overall power struggle that is not just within that region, but it's an international power struggle. So let's talk about a couple of things to kind of know about this, which is just background on the conflict, maybe how this has kind of developed over time.
I,
And let's go ahead.
just I want to just cover that geography just a little bit
Mhm,
more because I
mhm.
think part of what got missed here as well. It's a nice tight shot. It shows it right up against the Red Sea, Mediterranean to the north, etc. But what's not shown in here is a little bit further away. If you were to go a little further east, you got Iran, Iraq, which are
Mhm.
hot zones,
Right,
and obviously a little bit next to that, we're going to get into Ukraine. We're going to
right,
get into the whole Russian conflict. There have been talks about how Russia is looking at this destabilized region as perhaps an opportunity to get a foothold along the Red Sea, which has much larger geopolitical, geomilitary issues about it. Um, this uh, situation is being looked at opportunistically, I think, by other global powers, and the lack of stability here is going to be huge. That we need to get stability quickly, um, to avoid crisis because there's so many and there's many different levels. The humanitarian side,
sure.
there's other issues as well, the economic and so on. But yeah, as we jump into it, I want in the context of the geography to realize just how important this is. It's a tight shot, but if people should Google it on their own, pull back a little further. This is a really important
Yeah,
geography.
yeah. And so a couple things going on to that. So just as a little bit of a background, there was a coup a few years ago, and there was a replacement of the governmental power in Sudan, and two generals actually were joined in forces in that particular coup. And now what's happening is the Sudanese government has a set of military um, involvements now in this basically the development of a civil war. And you also have a separate general who was involved in a coup, who's now got his forces, and those are in great conflict. Uh, there is a ceasefire immediately right now. We don't know what happens when this ceasefire ends, but a couple of things to understand about how this all fits into sort of the economic importance and how it also fits into the geopolitical influences that are there. As
Mhm.
we showed, Saudi Arabia is on the other side of the Red Sea from Sudan. And so you have to look at the risk of shipping routes being disrupted. If you're trying to get from the Mediterranean Sea to the Arabian Sea or vice versa, you end up going through the Red Sea. You're going through the Suez Canal. One of the things to be aware of is that 90% of the world's goods, 90% is transported by sea. 1.85 billion metric tons of cargo is shipped every year by sea. And the Suez Canal alone has 12% of the world global trade.
Wow.
20,000 ships are going through the Suez Canal every year. That's over 6,000 more ships than go through the Panama Canal.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a, when you look at the Suez Canal, it's a 105 nautical mile waterway, but it's not really all that wide. So if we remember, and you probably remember this, back in March of 2021, there was a ship and it was called Ever Given. And boy, did it ever give, right? It went sideways. And so between the bow and stern, it ended up basically wedging into the adjacent sandbanks. And this was a really, really big ship, not just like a little ship. This is a really big one. It could actually handle 20,000 containers on it. And that's a lot of containers, right? The length of the ship was 1,312 feet. And when it went sideways, nothing could get through. For 6 days, nothing could get through the Suez Canal. 400 ships were held up, backed up. So if you just think about what ends up happening if this conflict spills over to the Red Sea and that there's a new toll gate put in, as an example, between Saudi Arabia and Sudan. And so just to kind of show how much importance there is to this conflict right now. And on top of that, you also have Russia, who wants to build a naval facility in this area. And they want to do it on the Sudan side. And so they're obviously trying to influence this. But at the same time, you got to remember that with all this shipping going on by sea, that Russia's been trying to develop a Arctic waterway themselves. They want to see the possibility of breaking ice out and having a northern route. And so
Mhm.
if you're coming from China, you're going up through the sea here, Red Sea, going up through the Suez Canal. But what if you ended up being able to go north? Somehow Russia would gain from that, and that's the Northern Sea route. And they want to continue to promote it as a global route, and they want to build this naval base in the Red Sea. So there's a lot of just importance on what's going on with the conflict. And
Mhm.
on top of that, there's a humanitarian crisis going on.
Yeah.
And right now, 70% of all of the grocery stores in the area of conflict are closed. You can't get food right now. You can't get water. People are in the streets looking for water, looking for food. So there's a humanitarian crisis. And on top of that, a lot of the support for the humanitarian needs are the same people that are being evacuated from there. On
Mhm.
top of that, you have a lot of people trying to flee the area. You don't want to stay in a war-torn area. Where are they fleeing to? As we were showing the map before, some of them are going to South Sudan, some are going to Chad, maybe even Egypt. So you're going to have this migration of people happening at the same time. And also, the reason why it's identified with Wuhan is because of something that happened that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of. And that is that we got a warning from the World Health Organization.
Yeah, that was big. This is big. This was a quiet point that I think's been under the radar with regard to
Mhm.
this crisis in Sudan. But yeah, that WHO announcement is jarring and was rather short.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Tell us about that
Okay.
World
So
Health Organization.
yeah, so I mean, the thing that's really interesting about this is that in the middle of a conflict like this, you have people on both sides who are trying to gain territory. And when they try to gain territory, they try to enter into buildings, they try to secure the building, they try to use it as a part of their war effort. Gives them protection and allows them to, set up a front line on whatever battle they're going through. They entered into in the capital city of Khartoum the laboratory that the World Health Organization had actually been providing samples to assist in research and development on developing vaccines. Now, what kind of biohazards were there that we're being warned at? We're being warned about these biohazards, and these are things like measles, cholera, um, and on top of that, the one they didn't mention, but something that should be really thought about here is the Ebola virus. Now, do you
Mm,
know that Uganda suffered a Ebola crisis, and they found that the cause of it was actually from the Sudan Ebola virus? Now, think about it. If it's called
mm,
the Sudan Ebola virus, do you really want to have the conflicting armies somehow taking control of this? What are they going to do? And by the way, what they did do is they got rid of everyone in that facility who had any kind of knowledge of how to handle these materials. So, what has been exposed? What's happening here? I mean, we could have an outbreak that spreads. By the way, the survival rate for Ebola, not very good.
yeah, Ebola is a very serious virus. Yeah, I think the broader picture here is that what's happening in Sudan is shaping up to be another uh, hit, I think, to the global geopolitical economic environment. Yes, there's an enormous humanitarian uh, uh, hit going on right now. It's horrible for these people. Um, but I think that our listeners should be aware of this because we have a lot of things stacking up that keep pointing us toward a significant recession. And to date, we haven't had it, or it hasn't been felt by as widely. But I think that the point that you're making here is that something we should keep our eye on, be aware of, and this could result in a global economic crisis. Even though people wouldn't think that Sudan would normally have that kind of impact or potential, this is shaping up to be. And the uh, the uh, this lab takeover by one of the
Mhm.
factions is just another part of this whole mix. Is
Well,
that kind of a fair summary?
sure. I mean, think about it. We had this question before when COVID started to appear, and the question was, where did it come from?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
was it from a fish market or was it from the lab that happened to be in that same city, Wuhan? So when we say, is it possible that Sudan is the new Wuhan? I think the
Hmm.
the the look really should be, tell us about the Sudan Ebola virus. Was it in that lab? Because if that starts to get out, there is no vaccine. There are experimental vaccines. I think Merck has worked on one, but there is nothing that's gone
Yeah.
to human trials. There's nothing. And by the way, you know why they have such a hard time trying to determine whether or not human trials would work with this? Um,
Yeah. And logic tells you, but go ahead. Go ahead and tell us.
I think our viewers are smart enough to know where that was going. So
It's tough to find volunteers.
yeah, tough to find volunteers.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there. Just leave it at that.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, looking it up right now, Ebola. There is no known cure at the moment, from what
right.
I'm seeing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a huge, and you get these factioning, these war factions going on. I don't know that they would be as hesitant to use it as a weapon, as a bioweapon. And once you get that thing out, you saw how quickly um, COVID,
Yeah.
it enveloped the world. I mean, within a matter of months, uh, this is a problem. This is a big problem.
Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about COVID because the public health emergency relating to COVID is likely to end on May 11th of 2023. And a couple of things to just be aware of for our listeners is that potentially this is going to change your health insurance benefits. So things like COVID-19 diagnostic testing, you now may be responsible for some or all the cost of the COVID-19
Yeah,
test,
yeah,
including over-the-counter purchases, and that's all going to go into effect, May 12th potentially.
yeah.
COVID-19 vaccinations, your vaccine or your boosters, they may require cost sharing now in your plan. And then another thing too is that as a part of the whole health emergency with COVID, individuals are given additional time to think about what kind of coverages they really needed. So that COVID-19 national emergency gave you more time to make key decisions on your health coverage. If you maybe got married, you have a new child, you would have an extension on the enrollment period so you could really give it some thought as to what worked for you. And that same thing applied to COBRA continuation coverage. But those extensions, and I think those were called the outbreak period. So it's basically an extension of time that you had to make your decisions. Those deadline extensions are going to all end now as of July 10, 23. So something to be really looking at there to say, okay, go back and take a look at your coverages. And maybe you need to get your booster now if that's something that you don't want to have to pay for all by yourself or in part or in whole, then take a look at those benefits and just realize that those dates are coming up very quickly.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yeah, I think there is reason for concern, even above and beyond the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, and just the fact that there is such an economic impact in sea transport. It's really something to be aware of and to think about just what would the spillover of any kind of disruption in transportation be, because you look at what comes from China, you look at what comes from
Yeah,
India, it's going up through the Red Sea.
that's right. It's connecting the Middle East and um, East Africa with essentially with Europe through the
Sure.
Mediterranean, so through the canal in
Mhm.
Europe. A great call, Alan. You're the one who put this one on the agenda. So thank you for keeping us aware, me and our listeners aware
Mhm.
of the potential crisis shaping up in as a result of the civil war in Sudan. We will certainly keep our eye on that. Um, and I think the takeaway is that this is just more pressure toward recession. Is kind of the summary of what I take on this. Again, humanitarian issues notwithstanding, that I hate it when people suffer through things like this. One of the reasons I'm keeping up my flag back here. That situation's got to change as well. Um, let's transition into our other topic of the day, which I think 24 hours ago it wasn't on our list, but I think it got pushed up to the top quite hard. Again, we're recording here Wednesday, April the 26th. Um, but First Republic Bank is back in the headlines. They had their earnings call, their first quarter results, and earnings call I think came out yesterday, if I remember correctly. Seems like eternity. And that
Came out
had
Monday. It actually came
uh,
out on Monday night after
that's right.
hours. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Monday. Okay. Monday night. After that's right. After trading.
Hmm.
So yesterday was the first trading day that included this material.
Hmm.
And boy, there were some. I think there were some bigger issues than everybody expected. Um, I've got a couple of highlights. I don't. If you want to run down a couple of quick things, or do you have anything you want to start off with just to get us
Yeah. Yeah.
into this
Real,
topic?
real high level. I'm going to start with this because um, there was a conference call that was pre-recorded and it was released with the earnings release, and it was 12 minutes and 9 seconds. And the first minute was all disclosure of forward-looking statements, et cetera. So it's really 11 minutes from Mike Roffler talking through, as the CEO of First Republic, talking through where they stood And he had a number of things which were really potentially positive statements that he made. But what we have is a real concern here about First Republic. And I want to just put out there that there's two things to think about. First of all, what drove this reaction in the market and what drove the flight of deposits at First Republic Bank? And what I'm going to say is that they got hit with the ricochet deposit bullet of Silicon Valley Bank. At that point, when we saw people rushing to get their money out, uninsured deposits pulling out, we started this tentacles of contagion. We talked about this in prior podcasts where it spreads. And what's spreading right now is this deposit withdrawal going across the regional banks. And I think that there's a number of points to talk into on that. But the starting point again that we've talked about is this tentacles of contagion. Where does it start and where does it end? And right now we're seeing that First Republic Bank is in the crosshairs. So we can talk through some of the key points that came out of that, but we can also talk about how this actually fits into the banking crisis and the narratives that are being brought out that say that this is simply a bank specific issue. And, I don't know if you agree with that, but that's how I'd like to open it up. Go ahead.
Um, Look, I'm going to condense down that. I've interesting reading. I want to condense it down to some simple things. If you read in that release, they say they lost 72 billion in deposits. Okay, wait a second. Didn't a consortium of big banks led by Chase drop in 30 billion
Mm-hmm.
during this time frame?
Mm-hmm.
So they really lost over $100 billion
Mm-hmm.
of depositor money
Yep.
left
Right.
the bank.
Right. Right.
I mean, that's pretty much a run on the bank, right? And so now when you look at what they have left, and the balance sheet's in part of the release, right? 104 billion of total deposits. That's almost half.
Right.
I mean, that's a tough hit to take. I mean, the fact that they're still standing, I think, is pretty amazing, right? Um, we've talked about the brand and how people love First Republic. The customers say how much they love First Republic, the excellent service, and so on. I mean, hoping it can survive, hoping that the worst is over. But I think this is what's going on. I think that the migration of deposits was much bigger than I think people realized or they thought. And now that reality, the black and white numbers have come out. And that's why yesterday was the first trading day, but the common person hadn't digested it yet. That got overnight. And of course, it's going to be on CNBC in the morning. This morning, I wasn't watching, so I don't know, but I can imagine that the results of this earnings report were all over last night's and this morning's news cycle. And this is the first trading day that gave people an opportunity to trade on it. And this is why the stock was trading today in intraday in the low mid $4 range.
Yeah.
And it's just a news cycle on
Right.
that on this thing.
It dropped all the way down to 4.76, and this brings up a
Yeah.
couple of interesting points, and it bounced back to 6. But here's the thing: when we were talking here and just mentioning it as a ricochet deposit bullet, it's the idea that if you had money in the bank and it wasn't insured, you need to get it out of there and move it somewhere else. And we advise people in this podcast that that's what they should do. Obviously, they were listening because they pulled it out of First Republic Bank as well, right? But that
Wow.
was huge. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
huge. And the thing about this is that there's a difference here. First of all, when we look at Silicon Valley Bank, we know that they had a lot of risk issues. The management at First Republic Bank was prudent in certain ways, in that if you actually go back and look at their financials, you'll see that they were actually taking steps in the fourth quarter of 2022 to rebalance their balance sheet. And they were already taking steps, and that hasn't really come out in the news at all. It hasn't been done
right,
in any meaningful way as analysis. And really, I think that the financial media has been overlooking some of these points, and they haven't been asking the questions, and maybe they're not going to get answers because maybe the regulators are telling First Republic they can't talk to people because ultimately we haven't stopped the fear. If you
right.
allow First Republic Bank to fail right now, you're admitting that your Federal Reserve and regulators are not functioning properly. If Joe Biden wants to run for president again, he needs to find a way to save First Republic Bank. If Gavin
Yep.
Newsom wants to be governor of California going forward, or he wants to have a shot at running for president, he needs to save First Republic Bank. If Janet Yellen wants to have her legacy be something that is not tarnished, she needs to get involved in saving First Republic Bank. If Jamie Dimon had enough confidence to pull together a 30 billion deal, why didn't he realize right then that the number needed to be a lot higher than that? Let me talk about something else about the financial crisis too. A lot of what's driven this is the fact that our mark to market accounting on available for sale highlighted the risk of the bank balance sheet. And this is
Yes,
the same kind of issue that we had in the 2008 financial crisis. I think there's a YouTube video out there that I saw recently. Actually, we're pulling up here.
there it
Brian
is.
Westberg did a great job of actually identifying the real truth of the financial crisis. And this points back to you probably remember this the speech I gave FAS 157, a troubled solution for
Mhm.
Financial Executives International. And I was pointing to Congress that they need to change the rules on the accounting. And I'm going to say the same thing today. They need to change the rules in relationship to a bank. Because if they're asking them to have it and hold it as capital, and they want to call it as a tier one, element as far as what's our tier one leverage ratio, well then fine, create it to where it has some stability, because that's what happened. They invested in what was supposed to be safe investments, and what ended up happening, they had a run on the bank. And this First Republic Bank potential failure is going to lead to, in my view, a lack of confidence in the banking system, and not just a recession, a severe recession, because consumers will stop spending. There will be fear. The tentacles of contagion are going to go forward. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree completely. I think we really need some new accounting rules that maybe they're just going to be bank specific. Um, the mark to market issue and the hold to maturity, it's somewhat arbitrary. It's at the discretion of management, right? You can make the decision to say, no, my intention is to hold this investment to maturity. Therefore, I do not need to mark to market. Well, how do you know? How do you make that? How do you do that analysis? Now, hopefully, the auditors are coming in with some what I believe the term is professional skepticism, right? That's what they
Hmm.
say
Sure.
when they're training us junior auditors. You have to maintain professional skepticism, right? Okay, great. Well, look, yes, I understand that that company is their name is at the top of the you know check or the deposit, the wire deposit that pays your bill, right? They're your client, they're paying you, they are paying you. But at the same time, you have to, as a professional standard, our whole system falls apart if the auditors don't have this professional skepticism and hold their feet to the fire on hold to maturity versus mark to market. But I think more fundamentally is that this system allows gaming and it
Right.
allows these issues to happen.
Right.
And I
Right.
think when those in the profession and understand these things, okay, we're not going to panic, right? Okay, yeah, all right, we get what's going on here. But the market in aggregate, society in aggregate, they don't understand these issues and this nuance. They hear about these problems.
Hmm.
And again, we talked before how these run on the banks, it's more of a psychological problem than a technical one, but it's these technical issues that trigger the psychology of the common person, right? So something has to shift, something has to change here. or else
Okay,
we're going to continue to have these
right.
problems.
I'm going to reload you on the financial crisis and tell you about something that happened there. And first of all, remember that the regional banks escaped with hardly any harm during that period of time. And
Okay.
they weren't looked at as being the problem. And so what ended up happening was it was the big banks. They were the ones that had all kinds of counterparty risk with the entire system. And they said all of a sudden, oh, we're not going to get paid. And what ended up happening is that a brand new program of injection of capital was created by the federal government in TARP, right? And
Hmm.
money came in. Now, on top of that, what also happened was that they were concerned about shorting the bank stocks and they put a halt to shorting the bank stocks. And what I think they need to do is go back to that playbook and say, you cannot short the regional banks. And here's what ends up happening if they do that. First of all, let's say there's a state government out there, some foreign state, who says, we can really benefit by destroying America. We'll go ahead and we'll just short the banking system on the regional level, and that's going to cause disruption to the economy. That's we love the chaos that comes from that.
Right.
Let's go ahead and just short the regional banks, and we get a couple to fail, and then we just go on and move on to the next target. Let's short it down. Let's say that's coming from Northern Korea. Let's say that's coming from China. Let's say that's coming from Russia. Where does our federal government and our leaders, Congress and our president, come into play with saying, let's go back to the playbook. Let's go back to 2008 and see what worked. What happened? We said, stop shorting. And we also said, we're changing the accounting rules. We need to do both right now.
Right.
If we want to save First Republic Bank, if we want to save this country from going into a severe recession, because what follows a severe recession? Depression. We haven't had one for a while.
Yep.
But let's not think that this is isolated to a single bank that has no systemic impact.
Absolutely right. I agree. I agree 100%. This is a significant issue. I'm really hoping that first, if you looked at the other fundamentals in that report, the earnings, the interest spreads, and so on, it's not that bad. I mean, their First Republic
Mhm.
management is doing the right thing. I mean, they're doing the best they can. How do you control $100 billion deposits leaving your bank? I mean, they dealt with very wealthy people who had a lot of money, and they felt safer diversifying it around. First Republic got sucked into this whole storyline, if you will, about the fundamentals that were the problem
Yeah,
on Silicon Valley Bank's
right,
balance sheet, and that just kind of fed a flame in the wrong direction, if you will. And it okay, so now we've got the reality of what happened. My hope is that we can have a much more sober approach now and to say, okay, and look, it's still standing.
right.
Come on
And
back. Get get
and
the get the
right.
deposits back in there. It's a great bank. It's
It's
great service.
yeah.
Let's keep
And
them
and they s-
alive.
and they serve a lot of communities and they serve a
Yep.
lot of nonprofits and
Yep.
they serve a lot of small businesses. And so it's not
Yep.
just the rich man's bank. And
That,
the
that's
thing
right.
about it is that what they are though is they are really important from a local community and a California community.
Hmm.
And obviously, where they end up is the same type of analysis that has to be applied to any other regional bank in any other part of the country. And so this issue is large, and there needs to be a step in at some level. Why not have the larger banks help contribute to the bailout of the smaller banks? Because otherwise, let's just reinvent the banking system
Yep.
because what we
Yep.
have right now isn't working.
I
So,
agree 100%. We're definitely going to keep our eye on this story.
mhm,
I know for a fact that we've not heard the last of what's going to be coming out of the First Republic story. Um, we will keep our eye on it for our listeners. We'll keep them posted of things as they happen. But I think for now, it's as a consumer, we just got to wait and see. We got to wait and see. As an investor, oh my God, what can I say? I'm going to stay away from that one because um, it's a very volatile situation. I think in a long-term investment standpoint, sure, if you're not going to retire for 20 years, might not be a bad way to make a bet. But if the psychology continues to go the way it is, then it could end up in FDIC, receivership as well. But fundamentally though, management at FRB, they're they're doing the right things. So let's see what happens. We'll keep our eyes on it. We'll keep our listeners informed. And I think we're bumping up on our time that we were trying to hit for today.
Sure. A lot to talk about. There'll be a lot to talk about next week.
Sounds great. Alan,
Good to
thanks
see you
again.
again. Sure.
Good to see you. And if anybody subscribe to our podcast, Avoid Crisis, we're on all the major podcast sources out there. And I've got the website up as well if you want, avoidcrisis.com, if you want to try to, see more about us in our episodes. With that, I think we will sign off for this episode, Alan.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.